Congressman Chris Smith, you've been OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's Special Representative on Human Trafficking for 12 years. Can you talk a bit about your role, both in the Parliamentary Assembly and in the U.S. Congress working on this issue?
Well, first of all, it's been an honor to be the Parliamentary Assembly's Special Rep for Trafficking. I regularly meet with delegations, with prime ministers, presidents even, heads of parliament, always with the same message. We need to be united in combating sex and labor trafficking, emphasizing prevention, prosecution of the traffickers, and a myriad of ways of protecting those who have already been hurt or are currently being hurt, get them to shelters. We are still on the cusp of what can be done. There's so much more that needs to be done. There's new initiatives. One that I've brought to the Parliamentary Assembly this week is the International Megan's Law, so that we notice each other when convicted pedophiles travel to each other's countries. I wrote a law on that was signed in February called International Megan's Law. So all of these best practices need to be not only embraced, but aggressively implemented to protect vulnerable women and children from sexual and labor exploitation.
So in your many years working on this issue, have you seen much progress in any areas, and what do you think the prospects are for eliminating this crime?
Well, I've seen an enormous amount of progress, an absolute consensus that we need to fight this. What concerns me is that sometimes there's a kind of compassion fatigue. People say, "Oh, we did that. Let's move on to something else." But this, every day there are people being trafficked, mostly women, mostly children, and it is modern day slavery. So we can't let up one bit. We know that in refugee flows, as people are moving, particularly out of the Middle East and in Syria and Iraq, that it's a high-rich target opportunity for these exploiters of women and children. So we need extra precautions to protect these vulnerable populations. And we need to go after demand. The idea that somehow you treat a woman as if she's a commodity that could be exploited. It's all about respect and protection, not exploitation. So we've made progress. Most of our respective countries in the OSCE space have very good laws on the books. Sometimes they await effective implementation, and that's up to the parliamentarians to do oversight to make sure that their respective agencies that implement are doing so robustly. Because again, always look at it this way: what if that were my daughter, or my child, my wife, or a loved one who was being trafficked? And when you personalize it and realize the cruelty that they face every day, the lack of hope as they're being raped and abused, you want to step in and do everything humanly possible to put yourself between them, the victims, and the traffickers, and provide every avenue of escape and protection.
Could you elaborate a bit on the role of the OSCE and the value of dialogue between North America, Europe, and Asia?
Sure. I think the OSCE itself was a stroke of genius. The Helsinki Final Act, which when it was originally agreed to in 1975, had its detractors because the Russians did sign. Obviously, things were pretty hot and heavy then with the Cold War, but we emphasized the human rights dimension very, very effectively as a West. The Europe and the United States and Canada. I traveled extensively in the 1980s, even got into a camp called Perm Camp 35, where Natan Sharansky and other great dissidents had spent huge amounts of time. It was in the Ural Mountains. I used the banner of being not only a congressman, but also a member of the Helsinki process. So it gave us a point of contact with then the Soviets, now Russians, and others, to engage on these principles. Once they've signed up, once they've agreed to the Helsinki Final Act and follow-up documents, we're not just saying we're telling you what to do pursuant to our law. We're saying this is an agreed-upon framework for the proper treatment of individuals, for security and for trade. So it's a very unique process. It needs to be replicated elsewhere in the world, in Asia, in Africa. So that there's this dialogue that leads to positive outcomes. It's not perfect, but it is a process. Multilateral diplomacy yields considerable fruit.
So later this year, the OSCE will be observing the U.S. elections as we've done every election since 2004. Can you talk a little bit about what the United States gains from this exercise?
Well, again, we're very transparent in the United States, and I think it's important. Every single election precinct has monitors and checkers. You can challenge somebody's vote to see whether or not they are who they say they are. Lots of checks and balances. Then we have the media that constantly looks for fraud, which is a good thing. You know, they have the newspapers and the TV and radio all on the lookout for vote buying and vote manipulation. And they have people who are viewing this from abroad. Adds yet another dimension of transparency to the process. We have voter fraud. In the United States, every country has it, some major in it, some minor in it. But I think the more we bring light and scrutiny, you know, somebody once said that light is the best disinfectant. So let's bring more light. And I think, you know, we can always learn from each other. The more we observe each other's elections, the more we get a better practice in operation to have free and fair elections. And of course, it's not just the day of election. It's access to the media before. It's the ability to get people registered properly without cumbersome procedures. So there's a myriad of ways to make sure it is free and fair, including and especially on Election Day.
Well, thanks a lot for talking to us, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. Thanks.